212 BC because he died in 212 BC, so it had to have been before that. And he gets credit for the law of reflection, and so you might think optics started then, but really not a whole lot happened between then and somewhere around the mid 1600s, the late 1600s, when Newton, by the way, Isaac Newton did not just develop the laws of mechanics, he did other things as well. He was actually quite a good optical person. People had been making telescopes. Remember Galileo? Does anybody here remember Galileo? You don't. Galileo made telescopes. He still saw the moons of Jupiter and all that good stuff. But he didn't really have a theory of optics. He just ground lenses, put them together the way he'd been told. And Newton, by the way, made the Newtonian telescope, which is still the most basic telescope in optical astronomy. He also developed Newton's rings. He didn't develop them, he observed them. And he developed the corpuscular theory of light, which was a real drawback. It served no real purpose. In fact, it confused and held back the subject of optics for a couple hundred years, until Max Planck brought it back to explain the black body spectrum. You remember 1900, he brings back the black body spectrum. He explains the black body spectrum because he has to introduce the photon, the quantum of light, and all of a sudden we have a duality, a wave-particle duality, and everything gets confused again. But between Newton and modern optics is a long gap which doesn't really get started to be filled until 1803, in my opinion. Because not a lot can happen until Thomas Young in England in 1803 performs the infamous double slit experiment. You're all familiar with the double slit experiment. You put a beam of light through two slits, it interferes, and it proves that light acts like a wave. And for the next 97 years, we all believe light is a wave, and it interferes, and it diffracts, and it does all kinds of things, and Thomas Young develops gratings, and it allows you to measure the wavelength, and this provides the fundamental information that people need to do spectroscopy, to study dispersion, for Fresnel to develop his theories, for people to understand the way light works and develop better theories to make better lenses, to make better optics. So I tend to think that's when modern optics gets going. Well, we can argue about that. But it puts an interesting thought in your mind. Modern optics, in my opinion, maybe in yours, we can argue about that, is about 200 years old, which means that the last 50 years have been about a quarter of the history of modern optics. It's my opinion. But that means I have been contemporaneous with a quarter of modern optics. That makes it sound like I'm even older than you think I am. But so has the laser and nonlinear optics been contemporaneous with a quarter of the whole field of modern optics. Just to give you a perspective on what's been going on. Well, actually, this comment here is a little bit of a stretch, because James Clerk Maxwell actually knew about nonlinear optics. Have anybody taken nonlinear optics so far? You can raise your hands. Come on, don't be embarrassed. You took the course. If you didn't fail it, you can raise your hand. What do they tell you? That you can expand the polarization of material in powers of the electric field. Well, Maxwell wrote that down. And then he said, oh goodness, those higher order terms are going to be too small. I'm only going to keep the first order term. And he uses that in his development of linear electromagnetics. Higher order terms would be too small, and he was right until the laser came along. And that's what leads to what we're going to talk about in terms of the early days of nonlinear optics. But in order to do that, I want to give you a sense of what it was like to do experiments in the olden days. Because you won't understand what it was like until you realize what we did not have. Because you guys have it easy by comparison. First of all, there were no optical tables. Think of that. If you wanted an optical table, you went to the gravestone company and you ordered a slab of granite and you had them polish it up as if it were a gravestone. You didn't engrave it with, here lies, you know, some hated professor who taught you a course that you didn't succeed in. And you brought it back to your laboratory. And of course you traded for space down in the basement because everybody beneath you would not want to be underneath.